Today, I'm going to show you how to do an oil change on a Ducati Monster. I'm doing it on a 2019 Monster 821, but this procedure is valid for years 2014 all the way through 2024. I'm making this video because I found nothing online that was totally correct. The workshop manual has inconsistencies, the forum posts have inconsistencies, and the YouTube videos are missing a little bit of information. So I'm going to put everything together in one spot, and I'm going to show you what I did, which is what I believe to be the way Ducati intended it to be. The first thing you're going to want to do is put your bike in a rear stand to make it upright. You can do it on the side stand with a block of wood underneath the side stand, but it can make your bike a little unstable, so you have to be really careful if you do that. Once the bike's in the rear stand, you want to start it and let it get up to temperature. That's around 150, 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you're going to want to shut your engine off. Once the bike is up to temperature, we're going to remove the drain plug as well as the oil filter, and that's going to drain all the oil from the system. Be sure to put a drain pan underneath the bike before starting, and then use a 5mm hex to remove the drain plug, as well as a universal oil filter removal tool to remove the oil filter. I like using the universal tool because the socket types tend to slip on the oil filters when you're loosening them, and in the case of this video, the drain plug was actually a little bit marred, so I ended up having to use a T30 Torx bit to remove it. So you're going to insert your hex into the drain plug bolt and then break the torque and loosen it. You're going to spin it all the way out until the oil starts to flow, and then you're going to really just let it sit for about 10 minutes until it just barely drips. Once that happens, you're going to slide the oil filter removal tool onto the oil filter and loosen it. Then, once it's loose, you're going to finish it by hand and spin it off. Once it's spun off, then it'll continue to drip, and then we can walk away. So once all the oil is drained from the system, we need to put the oil filter back and replace the drain plug. But for that, let's go through the materials we need as well as the tools. Starting from this side, we've got Motul 7100 oil. I bought a 4-liter container and just came off Amazon. You can also use Motul 300V or Ducati's recommended Shell oil. We've also got a Ducati OEM oil filter. This latest version ends in 9A, which supersedes all previous versions. And again, make sure you really get the OEM Ducati filter. We also have 3-bond 1215, which is Ducati's sealing compound for their gasket maker, and that is going to go on the drain plug. Important to note, this is not called out in the Monster 821 manual, but it should go on the drain plug. We're also going to need a new copper crush washer, and on this side, we've got the socket to install the oil filter. It's a 76mm by 8 flute socket. We've got the 5mm hex to install the drain plug. Again, I'll be using a T30 Torx. We need a torque wrench capable of both 13 Newton-meters for the oil filter and 20 Newton-meters for the drain plug, and a funnel to install the oil into both the oil filter as well as the main sump. So first, place that funnel in the filter and pour oil into it repeatedly until oil reaches the top surface of the filter. Once that's done, spread a thin coat of oil on the gasket to help seal it. Use your finger to spread it evenly across that rubber gasket, and once that's done, you're ready to install it. So go over to the bike and wipe the filter surface clean with a microfiber towel or some other rag. Slowly hand thread on the filter until it reaches the top. Then, with your torque wrench set to 13 Newton-meters with the oil filter socket on it, tighten and torque the oil filter to 13 Newton-meters. Once that's done, take the 3-bond 1215, squeeze a pea-sized dropout onto your finger, and slowly apply it to the threads of the drain plug. Once it's been applied to the drain plug, slip the copper washer over it. Make sure you're using a new one. Come back to the bike, wipe the oil off of the drain plug surface once more, thread by hand the drain plug into the threads. Once that's done, come with your torque wrench again, set to 20 Newton-meters, and slowly thread the drain plug up to the engine until it makes contact. Then tighten until you reach your applied torque. Once that's done, wipe the surface of any 3-bond which squeezed out of the sides. So here's where things start to get complicated. We need to access the mesh filter, but to do that, we need to remove the exhaust system. To remove the rear muffler, we need to access it using a 12mm wrench and a 6mm hex with a ratchet to accommodate that, as well as a 13mm socket to remove the clamp holding the mid-pipe to the muffler. That 13mm hex needs a ratchet, of course, and then to remove the mid-pipe from the remainder of the exhaust system, we need to remove the 2 springs. To remove the springs, I use needle nose pliers, but you can use also a spring removal tool or even an Allen key. So starting with the mid-pipe removal, we're going to take these needle nose pliers and insert them into the springs, pulling upwards to remove them off of the hooks on the mid-pipe itself. Then the springs come off. After that, we're going to take our ratchet with the 13mm hex to remove the clamp, just by loosening it and then sliding it off of the joint. We're going to take our 12mm wrench and our 6mm hex, starting by putting the wrench on the nut holding the back, and then we're going to come in with the 6mm hex and loosen the two. There's a washer in the back as well as a nut. Make sure to grab all of it. Hold the exhaust while you pull the bolt out, and then slowly lower the exhaust. You want to shimmy it until it starts to separate from the mid-pipe, and then pull it just to separate the joint. Once you do that, then you can work on the mid-pipe. This is a little bit complicated and takes some time. You want to grab the mid-pipe as well as the remainder of the exhaust system and shimmy it until it starts to come loose. Now that the exhaust isn't in the way, we can access the mesh filter. To get to the mesh filter, we first have to remove the mesh filter plug. To remove the mesh filter plug, we're going to use a 14mm hex. We can remove the mesh filter itself by using an 18mm hex. I ended up needing an adapter afterwards, and then after that, we can use a 12mm hex here to remove the intake service port from below. With a ratchet and the 14mm hex, place it on the mesh filter plug and break the torque. Be careful not to hit the mid-pipe too hard, just like I did. Next, place a rag underneath the plug and remove the plug itself. Also, be sure that the seal comes with it. Now, I've added an extension here to the ratchet and the 18mm hex to reach deep enough into the mesh filter. Press inwards and break the torque. It should be very little, and it's plastic, so be careful not to break it if it's not moving. Slowly spin until the mesh filter comes out, grab it with your fingers, and pull it out of the bike. Next, we're going to remove the intake service plug. To do that, we need the 12mm hex. Press it into the plug itself and break the torque just the same. Spin it until the plug comes out. And be careful, because on this one, the seal is a little bit more persistent. In my case, I had to use a blade to separate the seal from the crankcase. Be careful not to scratch the crankcase, as this is the sealing surface. So now that everything is torn apart, we want to clean it and put it back together. We're going to start with the mesh filter, which requires some gasoline to clean it. It's covered in sludge and metal flakes, and to remove all that, we're going to want a microfiber towel and an air compressor, but a can of compressed air also works. And to put the rest of it back together, we're going to need probably 2 torque wrenches. In my case, I have one that goes up to 200 inch-pounds, and then this one which goes up to about 700 inch-pounds. The torques we're going to need are 42 Newton meters and 10 Newton meters. And the materials we're going to need are the Loctite 271, which is permanent thread locker, which replaces Lock 5 in the Ducati manual. And then this, which is Shell Gaddis S2 V103, it has to be that exact part number, which replaces Ducati's Grease A. This is going to go on the mesh filter, and this is going to go on the intake service plug. Just like last time, what we needed to remove it, we're going to need the 18mm hex, the 14mm hex, as well as the 12mm hex. So we're going to take the intake service plug, apply Lock 5 to it, which again is Loctite 271, apply it to the perimeter of the threads, and smooth it over by finger. Then once that is complete, we are going to put on the aluminum washer onto it, part number shown there, and we're going to thread it into the crankcase. Once we thread it into the crankcase, we're going to apply a torque of 42 Newton meters, and use the 12mm hex. Once we've applied the torque, we want to clean our mesh filter. Soak it in gasoline, just like so, and have a microfiber towel underneath it. Wipe all of the sludge, oil, grease, etc. off, and some of the exterior particulate on the external surfaces and the internal surfaces. Next, use some compressed air, spray off all of the mesh filter portions, including the inside, outside, threads, etc. Once that's done, it should look something like this, which is nice and clean. We're going to take that Shell Gaddis S2 V103, again, Grease A from the Ducati manual, and apply it directly to the threads of the mesh filter. Put a pea size on your finger and spread it around the threads. Once you do that, we are going to insert the mesh filter back into the crankcase like so, and using our 18mm hex, we're going to thread it into the crankcase until it is finger tight. Once it's finger tight, we're going to apply the assembly torque to it. Assembly torque is 10 Newton meters. So next, per the Ducati manual, we need to reinstall the mesh filter plug. The mesh filter plug gets an aluminum washer here, and it has both a cutting side and a dull side. We need to put the cutting side towards the crankcase, and shown here, we can see the cutting side, and we can see the dull side. The cutting side is flat, and the dull side kind of has a rounded edge to it, so you want to make sure to put that flat side towards the crankcase when you put the washer on your plug. So then you place the washer on the plug, cutting side towards the crankcase. Clean the crankcase once more with a microfiber towel, and then with the cutting side forward towards the crankcase, thread the mesh filter plug back into the crankcase. Using a 14mm hex and a torque wrench set to 42 Newton meters, torque the mesh filter plug back into the crankcase. Last, before we put the exhaust on, and this is an optional step, I like to put a torque indicating material over my bolted joints, whether it's a screw, a plug, for example, or the oil filter. It just lets me look at the bike really quickly and know if anything's been tampered with or it's loosened while riding. I personally use Vibratite 202, and it looks like this. First, I apply the Vibratite from the crankcase over onto the mesh filter plug. After that, I apply it to the drain plug. I start on the drain plug and move it over to the crankcase. You can see I leave a nice bead. Following that, I put it on the intake service plug, starting on the plug, moving over to the crankcase. Last, I start on the crankcase and I put a bead over onto the oil filter. So now that all of that is done and our system is sealed, we can fill the system back up with oil. I like to do this part before reassembling the exhaust, just in case there's a leak. We don't have to do any more disassembly than what's required. First, remove the filler plug by hand. Once you remove the filler plug, place a funnel inside of the filler plug port and fill it with your oil of choice. Continue filling until the oil level reaches the max line shown through the sight glass, and replace the filler plug. Just finger tighten it and give it a good squeeze. Now that you've filled the system back up, check for leaks at the intake service port, the mesh filter port, drain plug, as well as the oil filter. And if nothing there is leaking, it's a pretty safe bet that the system is okay. So we're going to start by reinstalling the exhaust system now. We're going to install the mid-pipe, and then we're going to install the muffler. To reinstall the mid-pipe first, we're going to install it by hand, and then after that, we're going to position the springs again using the same tool you did to take the springs off. So to start, we're going to position the two pieces of the mid-pipe into the mating section of the exhaust assembly and shimmy it until basically the mark of where it was is aligned with the two pipes coming out of the cylinders. Replace the clamp, which goes on between the mid-pipe and the muffler. We're going to slide the muffler back onto the mid-pipe until it is fully mated. Then we're going to take the bolts previously removed and slide it through the muffler onto the hanger. Then, replacing the washer and that nut, we're going to use our 12mm wrench as well as the 6mm hex, and we're going to retighten the muffler to the frame. After that, we're going to use our 13mm socket and a ratchet to retighten the mid-pipe to the muffler. Take the tool you used to remove the springs, keeping the hook of the springs facing inwards towards the exhaust, and hook the bottom of the spring onto the mid-pipe and stretch it over and up onto the mating pipe. So now we've completely reassembled the bike and we've filled the oil up to the max level, but every time you start a bike after filling the level up, the oil is going to get sucked from the sump into different crevices of the engine, into the filter, in places that it can't get filled into while just doing an oil fill process. So you need to make sure to start the bike, suck the oil out of the sump, and then let the bike sit for about 10 to 15 minutes and see where the oil level ends up after starting the bike, and then post-fill to the max level again, just to make sure you have the right amount of oil. Here, we're going to let the oil get sucked up from the sump into the system. You can see the oil level draining from the sight glass. And then we're going to turn the bike off. We're going to let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. You can see here that the oil level was well below where the max line after we filled it from the beginning. So I placed the funnel back in the fill port and refilled the oil back up to the max line. And that is how you do an oil change on a Ducati Monster. If you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment, and thank you for watching. Boom, boom!